Welcome to the Impeach 47 podcast. We are bringing you directly into our latest reporting today, and we're looking at something that affects millions of people.
Yeah, it really does.
Because, as you likely know, the one big beautiful bill has already passed into law. It is enacted.
Yeah.
And the downstream effects we are seeing are just staggering.
Right. The legislation is already on the books, and that's really the anchor for everything we're diving into today.
Exactly. And, as investigative journalists at Impeach 47, our mission is to bring you the facts directly from our reporting. We're not here to take partisan sides or, tell you who to vote for.
No, not at all. We just follow the data.
Right. We just want to lay out the economic mechanics, and the documents and financial disclosures we've been digging through. They connect this newly passed law directly to this era of extreme wealth inequality.
Yeah, and specifically to a billionaire class that has, functionally opted out of American society altogether.
Which is a wild concept. But before we even get to the billionaires, let's just look at the sheer scale of the numbers on the ground. Because the reality of this enacted bill is, it's pretty bleak.
It's devastating.
Yeah. Our reporting shows that America already had, 27 million uninsured people before this law even existed.
Right.
And now, under the One Big Beautiful Bill, Medicaid eligibility will be stripped from 11.8 million more people over the next decade.
Which is just a massive number of people losing coverage. But what really matters here is understanding the actual mechanisms the law uses to drop that many people.
Right, because it doesn't just happen by accident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The legislation implements these strict new work requirements, and it mandates these highly complex, frequent eligibility checks.
Like endless paperwork.
Yeah, endless. And crucially, it reduces the federal matching rates that are provided to the states.
Wait, let's pause there for a second, because federal matching rates sounds like pure legislative jargon.
Oh, for sure.
How does changing a matching rate actively force a state to kick someone off Medicaid?
Well, so it comes down to how Medicaid is funded, right? It's a shared program. For every dollar a state spends, the federal government steps in and matches it.
Right.
And sometimes they cover 60, 70, or even 90% of the total cost, depending on the specific state and population. So states heavily rely on that federal money.
Okay, so when a law like the One Big Beautiful Bill slashes that federal percentage,
The states are left holding the bag. And since almost every state is legally required to balance its budget every single year, they can't just run a deficit.
right, they can't just borrow the difference.
No. So they have this immediate, massive financial hole. And the only mathematical way out is to cut enrollment. They tighten income limits, or they create those bureaucratic hurdles we mentioned, so people just fall out of the system.
Wow. So the federal government turns off the tap, and the states have basically no choice but to cut the lifelines. And the data we pulled for our reporting shows the cuts don't stop with Medicaid either. The new law also rolls back the Affordable Care Act's enhanced subsidies for marketplace plans.
Yeah, which hits a whole different demographic.
Right, because for anyone buying their own insurance, those subsidies are what lower the monthly premiums. If you cut that, a family's premium might suddenly jump by hundreds of dollars a month.
Really?
And the Congressional Budget Office estimates this specific rollback pushes another 4 to 5 million people right off their exchange coverage.
Yeah.
Because they literally just can't afford the new price tag.
It's pricing them out entirely.
Yeah. So you combine that with the Medicaid cuts, and we are looking at the national uninsured rate rocketing from roughly 8% back up to 15 or 16%.
Which, the international contrast here really puts that 16% into perspective.
Oh, definitely.
If you look at the Commonwealth Fund's 2024 International Health Policy Survey, the U.S. already spends more per capita on healthcare than any other country on Earth.
Wait, how much are we spending?
We are spending over $13,000 per person per year.
Jeez.
Meanwhile, look at our peer nations. Canada spends $6,100 per person. Germany is at $7,500. Japan spends just $4,800.
And they cover everyone.
Every single resident, yeah. The U.S. ranks last among high-income countries on access, equity, and administrative efficiency. But we rank first in cost.
Right. And that is the part of the math that, demands a deeper look. Because lawmakers explicitly framed the One Big Beautiful Bill to the public as a deficit reduction necessity.
Right, the old we can't afford it argument.
Yeah, they literally said, we simply can't afford to cover everyone. But if universal coverage works in literally every other wealthy nation for half the price, doesn't keeping 40 million people uninsured actually cost us more money in the long run?
Emphatically, yes. Economists who study these systems all agree, and the financial data bears that out completely.
Like a Lancet study we looked at.
Exactly. A major study published in The Lancet estimated that transitioning to a system like Medicare for All would actually save the U.S. $450 billion a year.
$450 billion.
A year.
Yeah.
And those savings primarily come from eliminating massive administrative redundancies, plus regulating pharmaceutical pricing. But the core issue is what happens to uninsured people when they get sick.
Because they still get sick.
Right. If you don't have insurance, you can't afford a primary care doctor. So you wait until a minor issue becomes a massive critical emergency, and then you go to the ER, which is legally required to treat you.
And emergency care is like the most expensive, least efficient way to deliver healthcare on the planet.
Precisely. So the uninsured patient gets hit with a $50,000 bill they can't possibly pay, but the hospital still has to keep the lights on and pay the surgeons.
So what do?
They write off the loss and raise the prices of every other procedure for the patients who do have insurance.
So it just shifts the burden.
Yeah, the insurance companies see their costs going up, so they raise the premiums on every insured person and every employer. Society still pays for the health care of the uninsured, but in the most chaotic, expensive way imaginable.
Wow. So based on the Congressional Budget Office's own data from our reporting, this new law isn't actually reducing the cost of health care at all.
Not even a little bit.
It just cuts federal spending by removing coverage from vulnerable people while pushing the actual financial burden onto local hospitals and insured taxpayers.
Which is why some of the financial experts we've spoken to describe it less as fiscal responsibility and more as a structural wealth transfer from Medicaid recipients directly to insurance company shareholders.
Right. And that brings so much clarity to the lobbying figures we pulled.
Oh, the lobbying numbers are wild.
Yeah, our reporting shows $700 million spent by health insurance lobbyists and $1.5 billion spent by pharmaceutical companies between 2019 and 2024.
Which makes the legislative push behind the One Big Beautiful Bill start to make complete structural sense.
It really does. But, you know, it's one thing to understand the corporate lobbying side of it. It's another to understand the mindset of the individuals actually funding the political apparatus.
Yeah, the mega donors.
Right. Like, why would a hyper-wealthy class acquire the legislative leverage to pass a bill that removes health care from millions of people, knowing it actually makes the overall system more expensive?
It's a great question.
And the answer we found in our reporting is pretty jarring. It's because the people funding the politicians do not use the public health care system. They barely use the public sphere at all.
Right. They've totally separated themselves.
Yeah, we took a hard look at the top 0.01%. People like Elon Musk, who is currently valued somewhere between $636 billion and $811 billion.
Staggering wealth.
Exactly. And this tier of wealth has completely structurally disconnected from American civic life.
And the footprint of that disconnect is highly visible once you know what you're looking for. They aren't just sending their kids to, like, elite private schools. They are literally building their own educational systems.
Right, like Musk's school.
Yeah, Musk founded the Ad Astra School. Jeff Bezos created the Bezos Academy. Mark Zuckerberg co-founded a private school.
It's a whole parallel system.
It really is. They use exclusive concierge medicine networks where doctors are just on retainer. They rely on massive private security details instead of local police. And their transportation is entirely insulated.
Oh, the private jets.
Yeah, just to give you a sense of scale on that alone, the top 125 billionaires emit nearly 3 million tons of CO2 annually just through aviation.
That rivals the carbon emissions of entire developing nations just from 125 people flying around.
Exactly.
They don't sit in traffic on deteriorating highways. They don't wait in commercial airports. And they aren't calling 911 when there's an emergency.
That's right. And this isn't just about luxury or, having nice things. It fundamentally alters their relationship to the state itself.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, just philosophically speaking.
Sure.
If someone builds a company and amasses billions of dollars, isn't it just a luxury purchase to build a private school or buy a private jet? Like, they have the capital, so they spend it.
That's the common argument, yeah.
So why does their private consumption matter at all to the public systems, like Medicaid or public infrastructure that we were just talking about?
Because civic disengagement at that level is the direct precondition for gutting public services.
How so?
Well, When the ultra-wealthy do not use public roads or public schools or public hospitals, they have absolutely zero stake in whether those systems function or collapse.
Because it doesn't affect their day-to-day lives.
Exactly. If you don't use a system, you have no personal incentive to maintain it. However, you have every financial incentive to defund it so you can lower your own tax burden. If you're paying millions in taxes for a public hospital network that you will literally never set foot in, your primary economic goal becomes defunding that network.
Which bridges us perfectly to how they actually execute that defunding. Because the desire to lower their tax burden wouldn't matter if they didn't have the mechanism to actually force the government's hand.
Right, and they do have the mechanism.
Yeah, so let's look at the machinery of campaign finance. Our reporting shows the floodgates really opened with the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision back in 2010.
Yeah, which allowed unlimited corporate and dark money into elections.
Exactly. And when we mapped out the spending for the 2024 election, the level of system capture was just staggering. Dark money hit an all-time record of $1.9 billion.
Unbelievable.
But the individual donor concentration is even wilder. Just 100 billionaire donors poured $2.6 billion into the elections.
Wow.
That means nearly 20% of all political spending in the entire country came from just 100 people. Elon Musk alone dropped $277 million.
And, if you track the legislative timeline, you can see exactly what that capital bought because the return on investment was immediate.
Oh, totally.
In the summer of 2025, right alongside the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill, Congress passed a massive tax package.
Yeah, the timing on that is incredible.
Right. And that package handed the top 1% an estimated $1 trillion in relief. It included expanded write-offs for private jets and heavily protected multi-million-dollar inheritances.
So just think about the juxtaposition of that legislative window. In the exact same session where Congress passed a bill gutting Medicaid and reducing federal nutrition assistance for working families, they successfully secured $1 trillion in tax relief for the wealthiest people on the planet. The individuals who funded the election secured the policy, while the populations who relied on the safety net absorbed all the cuts.
Right. Economists frequently refer to this specific dynamic as a K-shaped reality.
Okay, let's break that term down for a second because K-shape gets thrown around on the financial networks all the time.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like in practice?
Sure. So if you visualize the letter K, the vertical line represents an economic shock or just a baseline starting point.
Okay.
From there, the paths diverge. The top arm of the K shoots straight upward. This represents the asset-owning class, the top 1%. Their wealth accelerates through stock market gains, real estate appreciation, and, massive tax cuts.
Right, they're going up.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the bottom arm of the K angles firmly downward. That represents the wage-earning class, middle and lower-income households. They're facing inflation, stagnant wages, and the stripping away of social safety nets like Medicaid.
So one group pulls rapidly ahead while the other group physically loses ground.
Exactly.
And the wealth inequality data we pulled for our reporting paints that K in vivid colors. The middle class in America shrank from 61% of all households in 1971 down to about 51% in 2023.
That's a huge drop.
Yeah, and today the top 1% controls 31.7% of all U.S. wealth. In raw dollars, that is roughly $55 trillion.
Just an astronomical amount of capital.
And meanwhile, the bottom 50% of all Americans, literally half the country, holds just 2.5% of the net wealth.
And we really shouldn't treat that widening gap as some mysterious force of nature, right? The mechanics of this wealth transfer are incredibly well documented.
Oh, absolutely.
When capital grows faster than wages, inequality widens automatically. And a major driver of this is corporate stock buybacks.
Okay, so how do buybacks drive inequality mechanically without using any simple household analogies?
Well, mechanically, it's just a reduction of the share count. If a corporation takes its excess cash and just buys its own stock off the open market to retire it, the company itself hasn't produced anything new.
Right.
But because there are now fewer shares in circulation, every remaining share is instantly worth more. So executives and major shareholders legally inflate the value of their own assets without actually hiring any new workers or raising wages.
Wow.
Yeah, you add in decades of systemic deregulation and union busting, and the wage gap just explodes. Labor economists point out that the decline in collective bargaining alone accounts for up to a third of the entire growth in wage inequality since 1973.
So looking at all these intersecting forces from our reporting, the defunding of healthcare, the campaign finance dominance, the engineered wealth gaps, it really forces a critical question.
It does.
Is this extreme concentration of wealth just an inevitable feature of a modern economy? Or is it a reversible policy choice? Because for a lot of people looking at the numbers, it feels like this unstoppable machine.
It is absolutely a policy choice, and we know this with certainty because the United States already ran this exact experiment in the 20th century.
Right, the historical data.
Yeah. If you look at the economic data from the post-war era, specifically from 1945 to 1980, the top marginal income tax rate in the U.S. never fell below 70%.
Never below 70%.
Never. In fact, under President Eisenhower in the 1950s, which was a Republican administration, by the way, the top marginal rate hit 91%.
And, the immediate assumption people make today is that a 91% tax rate would instantly destroy the economy and kill all business investment. But that wasn't what happened at all, was it?
Not even close. That specific period saw the greatest middle-class expansion in American history. We saw rising real wages, broad home ownership, massive infrastructure projects like the interstate highway system, and plummeting poverty rates.
So how does an economy grow so rapidly with a 91% top tax rate?
Because of how it incentivized behavior. You only paid that 91% on the dollars earned way above a massive threshold. So if a business owner wanted to avoid paying that huge tax to the government, they had a very simple alternative. Reinvest the money back into the company. Because reinvested capital wasn't taxed as profit.
Right. So instead of hoarding profits or doing those stock buybacks we just talked about, executives built new factories, bought better equipment, and raised wages for their workers.
Exactly. The high tax rate literally forced capital back into the real economy. It wasn't until the Reagan tax cuts brought that top rate all the way down to 28% in 1988 that extreme inequality really skyrocketed.
Because the political promise back then was that cutting taxes at the top would pay for itself and lift all boats.
Right, the trickle-down theory. But the empirical data over the last 40 years shows that the only boats that rose were the yachts.
Yeah, the historical contrast is fascinating, and our investigation into current policy proposals highlights several mechanisms that could theoretically reverse this trend today.
Oh, there are plenty of viable solutions out there.
Like, for example, the Tax Policy Center has modeled out a 2% federal wealth tax on fortunes over $50 million. They estimate that alone would generate roughly $3 trillion in revenue over 10 years.
That's a massive influx of funding for a public system.
Yeah. And there are other proposals, too, from our reporting, like a financial transactions tax on high-frequency stock trades, or finally closing the carried interest loophole.
Well, the carried interest loophole is a perfect example of a policy designed specifically to protect extreme wealth.
Right. We hear that phrase mentioned on financial news networks all the time. But what is the carried interest loophole actually doing mechanically? How does a billionaire effectively pay a lower tax rate than, like, their administrative assistant?
So it's basically an accounting fiction written into the tax code. If you're a hedge fund manager or a private equity executive, your job is managing other people's money. And your compensation is taking a cut of the profits you generate. Normally, any compensation you receive for your labor is taxed as ordinary income, which currently maxes out around 37%.
Right, like a normal paycheck.
Exactly. But this loophole allows these executives to classify their compensation not as income, but as a return on investment capital gains. And the capital gains tax rate is capped much lower, right around 20%.
Unbelievable.
So the billionaire manager classifies their paycheck as an investment return and pays 20%, while the secretary earning a standard W-2 salary might be paying a higher effective rate on a fraction of the income.
It's entirely structural.
Yep.
But let me push back on the proposed solutions for a minute. Because whenever aggressive taxation on the ultra-wealthy is brought up, the immediate counter-argument from industry groups is capital flight.
Ah, yes. The exodus narrative.
Right. Let's look at California. They have AB 2289, the Millionaires Tax Initiative heading to the November 2026 ballot, and it's backed by 1.6 million signatures.
Right.
The argument against it is everywhere. If you pass this, the wealthy will simply pack up their private jets, move their headquarters to a state with no income tax, and drain the state's economy. Is that a legitimate threat?
It is the most common narrative deployed against wealth taxes, but the empirical facts on the ground tell a very different story.
What does the data say?
Let's look at the baseline. California already has the highest top income tax rate in the nation at 13.3%. Yet it remains the fifth largest economy in the entire world, and it continues to retain more Fortune 500 headquarters than almost any other state.
So they aren't leaving.
Not en masse, no. The idea of an apocalyptic exodus of the wealthy is largely a myth pushed by lobbying groups.
Why don't they leave, though?
Yeah.
If they can literally save millions by moving to Nevada or Texas, why stay in a high-tax jurisdiction?
Because wealth generation relies on infrastructure. Yes, the ultra-wealthy will grumble and they might publicly threaten to leave, but structurally, they stay.
What are they staying for?
They stay for the deep talent pools generated by the state's university systems. They stay for the world-class ports, the access to international markets, the tech ecosystems, and the cultural amenities. You cannot simply replicate Silicon Valley or Hollywood in a low-tax desert just by moving your legal address.
Right. The environment matters.
Exactly. When the largest state economy in the country runs a high-income tax regime for decades and continues to experience massive economic growth, that is the proof of concept. It demonstrates that a fairer tax structure does not destroy an economy. It funds the exact infrastructure that makes the economy viable in the first place.
Wow. So synthesizing everything we've looked at today, we're observing a system where the solutions to the healthcare crisis and wealth inequality are, well known, they have clear historical precedent, and they are economically viable. The obstacle preventing these solutions isn't a lack of capital or flawed math. The obstacle is that the individuals who would pay for these systems are the exact same individuals writing the billion-dollar campaign checks to ensure laws like the One Big Beautiful Bill pass instead.
Precisely. And that dynamic brings us to a final underlying thought for you to consider as we close this out.
Yeah.
Throughout this deep dive into our reporting, we've established that the ultra-wealthy have structured their lives to completely bypass the public sphere. They hold foreign residencies, offshore accounts, and private contingency plans that the rest of the country could never afford.
Right.
They increasingly view America not as a shared homeland, but merely as a legal jurisdiction, a marketplace for extraction.
A place to do business, but not a place to actually live.
Exactly. So the lingering question is this. If the people financing our elections and writing our laws have designed their lives so that the reality of those laws, the underfunded schools, the overwhelmed hospitals, the crumbling infrastructure never actually touches them, what happens to the concept of a shared national identity?
That's a profound question.
Right. Can a functioning democracy even survive when the architects of its policies do not live in the same reality as the people they govern?
That is the structural disconnect at the heart of this entire investigation. If Penthouse completely severs its ties to the foundation, it's really only a matter of time before the people on the ground floor realize they're holding up the sky for someone who isn't even in the building anymore.
Very well said.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into our reporting. We've only scratched the surface of the documents and data driving these policies. If you want to explore the primary sources and read our full investigations, you have to follow our work. Support independent accountability journalism by visiting impeach47.earth. You can also read our full articles on Substack and follow us on X, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at impeach47. We'll see you next time.